Are we on 44?
Yes.
Okay.
So we're week 29, chapter 44, verses 6 to 23. That's where we are. Anybody need questions, by the way, who doesn't have them? Yeah.
God was going to walk through the coming trials with them as he had walked with them in the past.
That's right. Why were the trials coming in the first place?
Because they're sin.
Yeah, it's God who brought the trials because of their sin. But he doesn't abandon them when he brings the trials on them. He walks through those trials. He walks through his own judgment with his people. Goes through things with them and strengthens them and helps them. What else?
He tells them over and over, "Fear not,
Mhm.
or you are mine."
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. Anything else?
He's going to transform his people.
Mm-hmm.
He chose them, and he chose to love them no matter what. And he's going to transform them and make them upright.
Yes. Are they not doing all the sacrifices and stuff already?
Yeah.
What's the problem?
Heart.
Yeah, they're going through the religious motions, but they're not actually worshiping the Lord, and he knows it. But he is going to bring transformation. And what we get over and over in Isaiah is that there's a deliverance from physical captivity that's important, but it's not what's most important. Mm-hmm. What's most important is the deliverance from spiritual captivity, and that's the thing that God keeps coming back to. Is if all he does is bring them back from Babylon, we're just going to go through the same thing over and over and over. What they really need is deliverance from the bondage of their sin. And that's what the Lord is looking ahead to, is a transformation of their hearts, which is going to come not through Cyrus, not through the deliverer who overtakes Babylon, but through the Messiah and the work of the Spirit. Okay, now continuing on with all of that, let's look at chapter 44, verses 6 to 23. This is what the Lord says, Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord Almighty. I am the first and I am the last. Apart from me, there is no God. Who then is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and lay out before me what has happened since I established my ancient people, and what is yet to come. Yes, let him foretell what will come. Do not tremble, do not be afraid. Did I not proclaim this and foretell it long ago? You are my witnesses. Is there any God besides me? No, there is no other rock. I know not one. All who make idols are nothing, and the things they treasure are worthless. Those who would speak up for them are blind. They are ignorant to their own shame. Who shapes a god and casts an idol which can profit him nothing? He and his kind will be put to shame. Craftsmen are nothing but men. Let them all come together and take their stand. They will be brought down to terror and infamy. The blacksmith takes a tool and works with it in the coals. He shapes an idol with hammers. He forges it with the might of his arm. He gets hungry and loses his strength. He drinks no water and grows faint. The carpenter measures with a line and makes an outline. With a marker, he roughs it out with chisels and marks it with compasses. He shapes it in the form of man in all his glory, that it may dwell in a shrine. He cut down cedars, or perhaps took a cypress or oak. He let it grow among the trees of the forest, or planted a pine, and the rain made it grow. It is man's fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself. He kindles a fire and makes bread, but he also fashions a god and worships it. He makes an idol and bows down to it. Half of the wood he burns in the fire. Over it he prepares his meal. He roasts his meat and eats his fill. He also warms himself and says, "Ah, I am warm, I see the fire." From the rest he makes a god, his idol. He bows down to it and worships. He prays to it and says, "Save me, you are my God." They know nothing, they understand nothing. Their eyes are plastered over so they cannot see, and their minds closed so they cannot understand. No one stops to think, no one has the knowledge or understanding to say, "Half of it I used for fuel. I even baked bread over its coals. I roasted meat and ate. Shall I make a detestable thing from what's left? Shall I bow down to a block of wood?" He feeds on ashes. A deluded heart misleads him. He cannot save himself or say, "Is not this thing in my right hand a lie?" Remember these things, O Jacob, for you are my servant, O Israel. I have made you, you are my servant. O Israel, I will not forget you. I have swept away your offenses like a cloud, your sins like the morning mist. Return to me, for I have redeemed you. Sing for joy, O heavens, for the Lord has done this. Shout aloud, O earth beneath. Burst into song, you mountains, you forests, and all your trees, for the Lord has redeemed Jacob. He displays his glory in Israel. Okay, So, at the start of this next section, how's the Lord described in verse 6? And what does he say about, well, how's he described first?
Israel's King and Redeemer, the Lord Almighty.
Yeah.
First and the last.
Mm-hmm. Are you getting the sense that something's being emphasized in these chapters? Anything at all? Like, he keeps saying these things over and over and over to make it clear he is not in the same category as the false gods of the nations or the idols that people make for themselves. It's not like he's a little higher or he's a little better. It's that there is no category for a God besides him. He's just completely unique. And he says it every way possible, and he says it multiple times. So, because there's some repetition here about the Lord's uniqueness, let's just pause and think again about who the Lord is and why it matters. I mean, if he keeps repeating it, we need to be reminded, right? So he's Israel's king. Why does that matter, that he's their king?
First thing that comes to my mind is that they begged for a king.
Mm-hmm. And they got a lot of lousy kings. And then they're going to get taken away into exile, and they're going to have no king. Who's their king?
They're going to be subject to several wicked kings.
Pagan kings, yep.
Pagan kings.
Mm-hmm. So why does it matter that right here the Lord starts by saying he's the king?
So they won't be tempted to follow other kings.
Mm-hmm. And isn't it, too, a temptation to feel like, well, that king's in control of me now? I mean, when Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes everything away, doesn't it feel like King Nebuchadnezzar's the one who's in control? And here's the Lord saying, whatever else the earthly kings do, he is Israel's sovereign. He's the one who rules. He's the one who leads and protects. He's the one who fights on their behalf. So whatever happens with the empires, whatever kings come and go, it's the Lord who's the ultimate king of Israel. And he's their redeemer. Why does that matter?
It should give them hope, give them courage, loyalty, dependency, and hope that they will be taken care of in spite of their circumstances.
What does the Redeemer do?
He pays a price for them, redeems. He turns in. He clips the coupon out of the newspaper and he takes it to the grocery store and he hands it in on the product and gets money back. So how does that relate?
Well, he's
I
going
mean,
to...
that's our modern day
Uh-huh.
redemption idea.
So he's going to buy the people back.
Mhm.
Who's he going to pay off?
Himself.
That's right. He's not paying off Babylon, is he? When he brings his people out of Babylon, he's just going to go in and take them when he's ready. He's going to avenge himself on their enemies. But that's not the ultimate redemption they need. The ultimate redemption they need is from sin. And who is it that he pays? He pays himself because he's paying off the just requirements of his own law. So if he's their redeemer, he's going to come and save them. He's not going to leave them where they are. He's going to come get them out of captivity. And yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I thought it was really significant last week how he kept repeating that he was the Redeemer and, shoot, what was the other one?
The Holy One of Israel.
The Holy One. Yeah, because it pointed out those two sides of what he was talking about, which was, you have failed my law. I am the Holy One. I am the standard. I am the Holy One. And I am also your Redeemer, which is why I'm going to save you.
Mm-hmm.
So like the Holy One and the Redeemer were two sides of the same God.
Yep.
And he was giving all the details of how both those things were playing out and giving his name to say that as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, similar here.
Yeah. And if you're really thinking about that, how can he be holy and redeem them at the same time? It takes the Messiah. There really is no other way for his holiness and his redemption to both be true, because he has to deal with sin somehow, but it's the Messiah who's gonna accomplish all of that. And he's the Lord of hosts, the Lord Almighty. Why does that matter?
He can do what he says he's going to do.
Yeah, he's the master of all the armies of heaven. So when the Babylonian army shows up, it might look like they have more power than the God of Israel, but they don't, because he controls the armies of all of heaven. he is the Lord of hosts. And then he says he's the first and the last. Why does that matter?
Can't just wait him out.
That's right. There's no waiting him out. That's right. If there was a God before him, that would imply there's a God who has some kind of knowledge or experience that he doesn't have, right? And if there's a God who comes after him, that implies that he has an end. But if he is the beginning and the end, if he's the first and the last, then there is no other God who has any kind of preeminence over him, who has any experience or knowledge that he doesn't, because he's limitless. And apart from him, there is no God. I mean, how much plainer can he make it? He's it. It's like he just says, I'm it. There is no other God besides him, which is precisely why the first commandment is the first commandment. So who he is and whose they are makes all the difference. And that's why he keeps repeating this. Every time he starts to say something, there's this pause to say, okay, remember who your God is. Remember who you are in relation to him. Okay, now what does he say then in verse 7?
Who then is like me? Let him prove it, lay it out and proclaim it. What has happened since I established my ancient people, and what is yet to come? Let him foretell what is to come.
So it's like if somebody hears him say, apart from me there is no God, and they want to argue with that. Oh yeah, there are other gods besides the Lord. It's like the Lord says, okay, step up and prove it. let this other God lay out the history of people since ancient times. Let that God foretell what's to come, because that's what the Lord has done. And again, he hasn't done it like, I don't know, I mean, if you read the horoscopes in the newspaper, they're vague enough that they could fit anybody kind of thing. That's not the kind of prophecy that the Lord is giving. The Lord is telling the people exactly what he's going to do, and he's even going to name Cyrus by name at the end of this chapter and again at the beginning of the next one. 150 years before Cyrus even shows up, the Lord's going to say, this is what's going to happen. And more to the point, he's telling the people 700 years beforehand that the Messiah is coming and what he's going to do and what he's going to look like. Here's the Lord giving very specific prophecies, and he's been doing this kind of thing from way back. How many of the other gods are doing that? He says none of them. None of them can do that. They're not telling their people what's to come. They're not foretelling what they're going to do because they're not real.
Makes me think of Elijah on Mount Carmel, and God saying, "No, come on, let's come have it out."
Yeah, that's right.
And Baal just
Exactly.
nothing there, and God was like fire from heaven.
Yeah,
And then he made it rain after a 7-year drought.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, now what does he say then to his people in verse 8?
Don't be afraid.
Again, he says, don't be afraid. Why?
We tend to be afraid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why is there no reason for us to be afraid, according to what he says in verse 8?
He is our God and our rock,
Mm-hmm.
our dear God.
Yep,
And he's proven it.
that's right. Everything that's happening, he says, was proclaimed and foretold by him long ago. Okay, now why is that a reason to not be afraid? Because it means that even when the situation is difficult, God is the one who's in control. And he has just said he's their king and their redeemer, which means that devastation is never going to be the last word for his people. So when destruction comes, it's not a sign that he's not sovereign. It's a sign that he is, because it happens exactly the way that he said it would. But here's the thing, if the destruction comes at his word and nobody can stop it, then deliverance also comes at his word and nobody can stop it. And when he decides to deliver his people, nothing's going to stand in his way. So the people are his witnesses that he told them generations ago they would go into exile and that they would be delivered. And this didn't just start with Isaiah. I mean, this goes all the way back to the covenant stipulations in Deuteronomy, to the promises God made to King Solomon after the dedication of the temple. There's a long history of the Lord saying, exile's coming for you if you break the stipulations of the covenant. And here's God being faithful to his word. But he's also promised to deliver them. Now, when he says there's no God besides him, there's no other rock, why do you think he uses the word rock right here?
Because it can't be moved.
Solid.
Yeah. And what about the gods that you make for yourself?
They were made out of wood.
Yeah, you can pick them up and put them where you want, right?
And you have to
Cook your
bolt
supper
them
over
down.
them.
You can cook your supper over them, and
The last chapter, you had to bolt them down.
that's right.
They topple over.
Yep.
I love that.
Yeah, me too.
And if your God's in your way, can't you just move him off to a corner and leave him there for a while until you're ready to deal with him
And your
again?
way, it has to be dusted.
It's true. You have to dust your God, that's right. Yeah. Those gods are movable, they're shakeable. But God is not. He's an unmovable refuge. He's an unshakable foundation, even for the people for the people who are in the middle of difficult circumstances. Why do you need a refuge if you don't go through anything difficult? The difficulties are the precise reason why you need a refuge, and the Lord is the rock, and there is no one besides him. There's no other place to find refuge. Okay, now what does Isaiah say about idols and idolaters in verse 9?
They're futile and have no profit.
Yes. Both the idols and the people who make them, right? So,
They're worthless.
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Those who would speak up for them are blind. They are ignorant to their own shame.
Okay, now that connection between the idols and the idol worshippers is significant, and we've been seeing it all over the book of Isaiah, which is we become what we worship. If you worship empty and worthless things, you become empty and worthless. Or to put it another way, if you worship a dead God, you will become spiritually dead, with spiritual senses that don't work. If you worship the living God, you will become spiritually alive, with spiritual senses that do work. People who make up their own gods and then defend them are blind and ignorant to their own shame. But the reason they're blind and ignorant is because they're worshiping gods that are blind and ignorant, and they become what they worship. Okay, now, verses 10 and 11, continue that thought. What does he say next?
Idols are worthless.
Mm-hmm. Keep going, because now he goes beyond worthlessness to something else.
And they're made by people.
Uh-huh. And the people who trust in them, what will be the outcome for them?
Shame.
Yep, shame and terror, right? So this repetition of shame and terror is important. I mean, when he says, who shapes a god and casts an idol, it's just an emphasis on how stupid it is. It's really foolish to be doing that, because if you shape your own god, you're sovereign over it. In contrast to the true God who shaped everything himself, these gods are shaped by human beings. So the craftsman who makes an idol is only a person, and the end result is that he's worshiping a human, he's worshiping this human-made God, and it's going to bring him to shame. If he's looking to that for refuge, there is going to be no refuge in that God. There's just going to be terror and disgrace, because that God's going to let him down. Idolatry might feel safe. Isn't that why people do it?
Yeah.
Because it gives you a sense of security and control. But actually, idolatry leaves you completely vulnerable, because there's nothing to protect you outside of yourself. So, disgrace and terror will be the end result. Because nothing will save them. Nothing will be their refuge or strength. Nothing will protect them. Okay, now, in the next verses, Isaiah is going to put the irony of idolatry front and center. And the way he does it is by taking us backward, step by step, from the end of the process to the beginning of the process of making an idol. And he's going to show in each stage how ludicrous it is for humans to make their own gods. But I think the reason he's doing it backwards is because there's a particular emphasis on where the god comes from, which is what we get to at the end. What is the origin of this god? That's what he's going to emphasize last. Okay, so let's start with verse 12. The final step first. What happens last in verse 12?
He gets hungry and loses his strength.
Who?
The craftsman.
Yeah, here's the blacksmith, right?
Yeah, the blacksmith.
Mhm.
Drinks no water, he's too busy. I
Mhm.
thought that is true, because sometimes you get out in the garden, and I'm so busy in that garden, it's like, oh, I need to go drink water.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah.
Yeah. You notice the emphasis on the power and strength of the blacksmith. How it keeps talking about how he's working it with a tool, he's shaping the idol with a hammer, he forges it with his own might, but how powerful and strong is he really? Because he himself gets hungry and tired, he gets thirsty and he grows faint. This God-making stuff is a tiresome business, man. It'll wear you out. And if the God-maker gets tired and weak, what does that imply about the power and strength of the God he's making? I mean, again, just think about the contrast with the living God who created the whole world with a word. You're going to get strength from this idol when the person who makes it runs out of strength even while they're making it? That doesn't make any sense, but that's what people do. Okay, now he describes the middle step in verse 13. What does he say?
The carpenter is measuring and making an outline, roughs it out and marks it with compasses. And he cuts down cedar, cypress, or oak. But then it's a man's fuel for burning. Some of it he takes and warms himself, bakes bread, and also makes a god and worships it.
Yeah. So in this middle step in 13, it's interesting that he emphasizes at the end of that verse, whose form is it made in? The form of human beings, that's right. It's in the form of a person. So here's this carpenter who's he's deciding what his God is going to look like. Basically, he makes it like himself. I mean, it might not be a mirror reflection of himself, but isn't he making it according to the things he knows in creation and making it to reflect human glory? And where does it live when he's done?
Shrine.
Yeah, it's in a shrine. Literally what the text says is a house. So he's got a house that he has to put his idol in. Well, God has a house. What's the difference? I mean, God calls the temple his house. What?
God says for eternity,
Uh-huh.
and the wooden thing is just like, it's gonna go in the fire and it's done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When Solomon dedicated the temple and he prayed to God and God answered him, it's really interesting. One of the things God said is he said, "Don't think that I live here. I don't live in this building because I'm too big to be contained by this building." Like, that building is a symbol of the presence of God, but it doesn't contain him. But the gods that people make for themselves, like, you put it in a shrine to protect it, because you gotta keep it from being destroyed if you're gonna make it yourself.
And they have to carry it in,
That's right.
you know.
That's right. And dust it. That's right.
I wondered if they had to update their idols.
Probably.
Like we do through life, we have to update.
Uh-huh.
It becomes old fashioned, so we have to add something to it.
Yeah. It'd be like nobody does their hair like that anymore. Let's change that. Yeah. All that effort just to project themselves as God, because that's what they're doing. You can make God be however you want if you're the one who's going to decide what he's like. And I thought, we don't, in our culture, it's not so common for people to spend time carving out gods. But I was watching this television show one time where there were these two characters having a conversation. One of them was talking about the justice of God, and the other one said, "I don't like to think about God that way. I like to think about God as just being kind." Is that not exactly the same thing? It's just deciding for yourself who your God is going to be. You don't have to carve him in a certain way. You're just choosing, okay, this is how I'm going to think about him, which is no different. You're just making an idol for yourself because you're choosing the bits of God that you like and putting aside things that you don't. And then, you mentioned verse 14. He cuts down cedars, or cypress, oak, some kind of nice tree. What is it that makes the tree grow? Yeah, God, because it's the rain, right? He has to wait. I mean, think about the irony of that. He has to wait for the rain to come in order to make the tree grow, and then he cuts down the tree to make his God. Like, where did the rain come from to start with? From a God who's not made out of a tree. It's crazy. I mean, the emphasis at the end is, what's the origin of his God? Where did he get the material for his human-looking idol? From a tree. Now, it's a nice tree, but it's still a tree. It's just a piece of wood. That's where his God comes from. I mean, outside of the Lord, who reveals himself, there are only man-made gods. Idolatry is not just making God, it's also making God what you want him to be. And a God who's fashioned to serve you can't save you. And the whole description, Isaiah is just pointing out how ludicrous it is. Okay, now let's talk about the really crazy bit where he pulls out the stops in 15 to 17. So what does he say? I mean, what's the emphasis in these verses? Because he repeats himself quite a lot right here, and I think it's to say, can you believe they do this? What do they do that's so shocking? What do we do that's so shocking?
The material that they use to create their gods, they burn.
Yeah. So you use half of it to make a god and the other half to cook your lunch, right? Or to stay warm. So here's this guy who cuts down this tree to make his god, and then he bows down to a burnable god, and he prays that it will save him. And it's like Isaiah saying, can you believe they really do that? I mean, the whole thing is just dripping with irony. Like, he doesn't even have to say, it's so stupid. It's so stupid to take half of the material and make your god out of it, and the other half and burn it. Yeah, it's so stupid. He doesn't have to say it, but he does. Because what does he say next in verse 18?
These people know nothing. They understand nothing. They cannot see with their eyes. Their minds are closed.
Mm-hmm. To look to a burnable god and to pray to it and to ask it to save you. He says, why do you do that? Because you can't see. Because you can't think. They have eyes, but they don't see. They have minds, but they don't comprehend. And if you've been tracking this all through Isaiah, you know the reason, because Isaiah has told us over and over and over. Idolatry has made humanity spiritually insensible. Not some people in humanity. All of humanity has been made spiritually insensible because of idolatry. Humanity is completely unable to discern what should be obvious, which is, this thing cannot save me. But this is not an intellectual problem, is it? This is a spiritual problem, right? I mean, you look at it and you think it's so stupid. It is stupid, but it's not an intellectual problem, it's a spiritual one. Because, he says, their eyes have been plastered over, so they can't see. Well, Isaiah's told us it's the judgment that God brings on people who prefer to worship dead gods to him. People choose the darkness, and God gives them what they want. And when they get the darkness that they want, they become unable to see what's right in front of them, which is, if I make this God for myself, obviously I can't see.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I have the NASB version.
Yep.
And in verse 18 it says, they do not know, nor do they understand, for he has smeared over their eyes,
Mm-hmm.
instead of the R plastered over. So that's obviously uncomfortable.
Yes.
So what is the, like NASB claims to be the literal
Mm-hmm.
interpretation here. What is the part of that?
I'm not sure if the original text is that he did it, or if the original text is a passive with no subject clear. I mean, with no agent clear.
Yeah.
A lot of times the Hebrew uses what they call a divine passive, where it's using a passive tense as in to say it is happening to them without saying who's doing it.
Okay.
But it's clear from the context that the only person who could be doing it is God.
Okay.
So whether it's literally a passive, which says their eyes are plastered over, or they've looked at that and said it's a divine passive, maybe they've looked at that and said it's a divine passive, so they've done it that way, or whether it's the other way around, where it says, God did it, and everyone else would like to say, I don't know which one it is in the Hebrew, but I think the context makes it clear that it is a divine action. I mean, this plastering over, even if it's a passive that's a bit vague, the context does not leave it vague. Because Isaiah said, God said, way back in chapter 6, who is it who makes people blind and deaf? It's God. God is the one who does that because it's his judgment on idolatry. So they are right, whatever it is that's literal, it is God who's doing the plastering. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Brittany, for bringing that up, because King James was the same thing.
And it looks like
Says
his BSB
he has
does
shut their eyes, from smeared over their eyes.
Yeah, and I think the BSB does too.
I have muddied their eyes,
But does it
as
say
well
that God
as
did
their
it?
hearts, and so they cannot understand.
Does it say he did it, or does it say their hearts have been
Let's see. They do not know, they do not understand, for God has muddied their eyes, so they cannot see, and their hearts and minds as well, so they cannot understand.
What version is that?
Amplified.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
I like
I
the
love the
amplified.
muddy.
Yeah.
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 See, and I would guess that it probably says that he plastered or muddied their eyes without saying God,
Okay.
which is a little
Which is
bit
this, yeah.
ambiguous because God hasn't been mentioned in the previous context for a while. So when it says he, who's it talking about? Well, we know from the context it's talking about God. So
Uh-huh.
some of them make it, really clear that he is God. Some of them put it in the passive.
Okay.
But
yeah.
it is God who does it. And you're right, it does make people uncomfortable.
It definitely shows you why in our age so many things are changing as far as our gender, abortion, and all those things because they're right in their own eyes. And
Is-
he,
The end of Romans 1 is this. The bit where Paul says at the end of Romans 1 that God gives people over to a reprobate mind because it's what they want. God gives them over to it. What Paul's describing in Romans 1 is the same thing that Isaiah is talking about all over the place. Is that if you pursue false gods, at some point God gives you what you want, and then you become unable to discern what should be really obvious. Idolatry makes you stupid, basically.
Well, and we have the Holy Spirit, so we can tap that goodness of God.
That's right, because without the Spirit you can't see. But that's the thing, that with the Spirit it starts to open your eyes. Now you can see and you can hear. Yeah. Okay, now what does he add in verse 19?
They don't stop to think their knowledge and understanding are lacking. Did we do this already? Half of the wood was
No.
used to meet basic household needs. The other half used to form a detestable idol. Shall I bow to a block of wood?
We didn't do this already, but he keeps repeating it. Why does he keep repeating it? Because it's his way of saying it's important and people are being stupid. Right? So literally what the text says at the beginning is no one brings it to his heart. That is, no one has the capacity to connect the dots, to see the foolishness of using the same material to fuel a fire and for cooking food as to make an abomination from what's left and bow down to it. Now it's interesting that he uses the word abomination or a detestable thing, your translation might say. It's not a mistake. It is an abomination. It's not just, oh, isn't that... I hear people say this sometimes, even with religions that have very blatant idol worship, as if it's not really that big of a deal. It is an abomination to God. Why? Well, first, because it misrepresents the living God, as if this is what he's really like when it's not. And second, because for humans to bow down to a block of wood is a degradation that God never intended for creatures made in his image. Human beings are not supposed to be worshiping things that are lower than they are. They're supposed to be worshiping the God who's higher than they are. And to do otherwise is to degrade ourselves. And so it is an abomination both to God and to the way his image is then represented when people bow down to false gods.
I hope I'm not taking this off a little bit, but I just got to tell you that last night, Tony had walked into the garage, just, because, oh, I could do something, just doesn't usually do that, walking into the garage, and then I heard him screaming frantically, come here, Susan, come here. So I jumped up, came in there, and he said, we've got a snake in here. I said, oh, okay, all right, so, and he saw it, and it was big, that's all he said, it's very big, and it crawled into the corner of the garage. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it. He couldn't see it, or he couldn't hear it. He saw it, I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, and it constantly went, didn't stop, and it go, anyway, click, 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 and so, to make a long story short, I'm getting very frantic, because Tony says, well, I'll just do, I said, you can't hear it, and you don't know how close you are, it's right there. I just became so exasperated, I called his son, who is such a, I said, will you please talk to your dad and tell him, talk some sense into him, he's right there. He said, okay, so he talks to him, and I could hear Tony say, why doesn't anybody ever trust me? Well, I know who's best, and the old, reminds me sometimes of my dad. And finally I thought, I've got to do something. And I wasn't even stopping to think, Lord, you got this. You can, I didn't. I just ran to the neighbors and said, we got a snake in our yard. Can you come? Then he comes and I find out he can't hear. He can't hear it either. And so we start taking everything off to get to this corner. We did eventually get it. It was the largest prairie snake, rattlesnake I have ever seen in my life. It was 9 beads. It was so big. And the lady that was with the neighbor, it's not his wife, she was older than he was, older than Tony, I think. She said, well, let's just put it in this box and keep it alive. I said, no. No, we've got pets. We're not going to keep it alive. And Tony's yelled, look it, lady, kill it. So it was quite a hassle. So when I came back inside, I had a message from Chris, Tony's son, and he said, Susan, I'm sorry I couldn't help, but listen, let's just pray and trust God. He's the one that made the creation. I thought, wow, Chris, I never even thought about that, He was just so sweet. I love you both. Take a deep breath, pray, and trust. And I thought, how did I get sucked into this thing? Because I didn't even consider the God who created the snake. He could handle it, but although he did, he handled it. But there's my little insert I had to share. And it was the biggest snake ever.
So did you kill it?
Yeah, Tony, the guy was going to put it in the box, because it was crawling towards us, and Tony just took the shovel, went and cut there were 5 beads, I think, here, 5 beads and 4 beads on the snake. So, yeah, it was the biggest. We have not had any problems at all with snakes at all.
He's been eating all of
Yeah, well, and the cat came in last night, and what's going on in here? I smell the blood, But I've been sticking my hands under things and gardening, and I thought that could very easily have been the green hoop house that we have, and put my hands, didn't even think about it. But I thought the thing that came to mind was God divinely was in control as he had brought Tony inside the garage. We were getting ready to shut the door. He saw the snake. Although I didn't see it, he saw the snake at his divine time. And I could have gotten in the car this morning and, yeah. So, or he could have. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take you off.
It's okay. When you have a rattlesnake story, you just want to tell somebody, don't you?
Yeah.
Well, in her pictures on Facebook, it's the biggest one I've seen.
Yeah, it was scary.
Yeah.
All right, let's keep going.
Okay,
So,
sorry.
that's okay. Verse 20. What does he say in verse 20?
As we were reading this, I was just feeling like, how can they not see? And then this is the key, a deluded heart misleads them.
Yep. And he says that person with the deluded heart feeds on ashes. That's an interesting way to put it. It's like a person sits down and eats a meal, and it's not lousy food, it's not cheap food, it's not burnt food, it's no food. There's nothing but ashes that are left when the substance is gone. And if that's all you eat, you're going to die. And idolatry is like that. You're filling yourself up with nothing. So why do people do that? Because their hearts are deluded and misled. People can't free themselves from that delusion. They can't save themselves from the deadening effects of idolatry. Isaiah says they can't even look at the thing in their hand and see that it's a lie. One of the commentators said, the idolater is hooked on the idol, and he's lost all capacity to free himself. The idolater holds his idol, the product of his own strength, but the reality is that the idol now holds him, and he cannot break free from the bondage of the lie. That's right, you gotta have somebody outside of yourself come and free you from it, because you can't free yourself from that delusion. Okay, now what does the Lord then say to his people in verses 21 and 22?
Well, 2 words stood out: remember and return.
That's right. So he calls him again, Jacob and Israel, this reminder of their set apartness, because in his sovereign grace he chose them for himself. And he tells them, remember these things because they're his servant. What things? Well, the things he just said in order to distinguish himself from the false gods of the nations. Here's the thing, the pagans fashioned their God, but Israel was fashioned by their God. The pagans can't save themselves. Israel's going to be saved by the Lord. The pagans serve blocks of wood. The Israelites serve the Lord. And he will not forget them. That's really important. But he is going to forget something. What is it that he's going to? Their sins. That's what he's going to forget. I mean, verse 22 says, he's swept away their offenses like a cloud. Like there's, like the morning mist. I thought that, how long do the clouds and the fog last in the morning?
It depends on where you live.
How long do they last in Wyoming?
Not very long.
It lasts pretty long.
But,
As soon as you drive up out of Hudson,
Yep.
it's sunny and bright.
That's right. It's so easy for those things to get swept away, and the Lord is going to forget the sins of his people like that, but he's not going to forget them. That's really important. I was reading a story one time about a couple. They were much older, and the wife had dementia, and she knew that it was really slow progressing, and she knew what was happening. And one day she just said to her husband, she said, what's going to happen if I forget God? Like, what if I forget Jesus? And her husband said, the important thing is not that you remember him. The important thing is that he remembers you. And he's not going to forget you. And I thought of that when I read this. I thought, he doesn't forget his people. He forgets our sin. But he does not forget us. And he did not forget them. He's brought him back. He's redeemed him. He's the Redeemer. He's the King. And he's going to bring his people out of bondage. And he's going to, not just from exile, but the bondage from sin. He's going to deliver his people from the bondage of idolatry, from the darkness that comes with worshiping false gods. And that's what you see happen all over the gospel accounts. Jesus, just right and left, is opening people's eyes, not just physically, but spiritually, to be able to see and to understand who their God is. Now, if God's going to redeem his people, if he's going to forget their sins and he's going to redeem them, then it makes sense what Isaiah adds last. What does he say in verse 23?
Sing and shout.
Mm-hmm. Why?
For joy, because the Lord has redeemed us.
Because, for the Lord's the one who's done this. He's redeemed us. And who does he call to shout aloud?
Oh, heavens.
Earth, mountain.
The whole creation, right? This isn't just a matter for the people of Israel to be rejoicing over. All of creation rejoices over this. If the Redeemer is the Creator, then the work of redemption has consequences for the whole of creation. So Isaiah calls the heavens to sing for joy, the earth to shout aloud because of what the Lord has done. Calls mountains and forests and trees to burst into song. The creation is not supposed to be material for making God, which is what the pagans are doing. The creation is supposed to be material for praising God. So the whole world belongs to him and it serves his purposes. And Isaiah calls creation to rejoice because the Lord has redeemed his people and displays his glory in them. Here's the thing, when the bondage of sin is fully and finally dealt with, not only God's people, but all of creation will be liberated. That's a liberty so far beyond coming out of Babylon. It's a liberty that's going to affect everything that God has made. Okay, how's this relevant to us?
Well, I think verse 22 is great to memorize or have around for comfort because it's a wonderful reminder of my salvation.
Mm-hmm.
And I need reminders a lot, that I'm forgiven
Yes.
for the things that I say or do
Mm-hmm.
or have done. So I like that verse a lot.
All three of those verses.
Yeah, but that's too much for me to memorize.
You can do it. No, you can do it.
You think, huh? You need to be at my house in the morning before coffee.
But it's interesting how you can memorize and you can't think of it, but when you're in a hard time, all of a sudden that memory comes back and it refreshes you. Of course, sometimes I have to go on and ask, where's this verse, But, yeah.
Refrigerator magnet. We can make our own.
Yeah.
Just sing for joy, O heavens, for the Lord has done this. Shout aloud.
That's
Just the
amazing.
singing and the shouting and the joy is just When
Yeah.
it's just uplifting.
Yeah.
It's,
And we were
Wonderful.
talking recently about, we brought this up, and somebody else had heard this too, that, I can't remember where I heard it, see, can't remember. But I do remember that when you entertain joy or entertain,
Peace.
peace and trusting, you can't, our minds cannot entertain the other, because they come at different times. Remember we talked about that before? I just thought that was from a medical term. Can't remember where I heard it from, but I do remember what Susan, just put your joy in the Lord and don't fret over stuff. And boy, it does work.
Anything else? Comments? Anything?